The moment Walter Wallace rode back into Caldwell, Kansas, on a blistering June afternoon in 1884, the first thing he saw was Wilhelmina Hawkins hanging laundry on the line outside the boarding house. And the second thing he felt was the particular kind of ache that only lives in the chest of a man who left something precious and spent 10 years pretending he had not. He pulled his horse to a slow walk on the main street, letting the animal find its rhythm on the packed dirt road that he had once known better than the lines of his own hands. Caldwell had changed in 10 years. New storefronts had gone up along the north end of the street. A proper hotel with a painted sign now stood where the old tannery used to be, and the railroad depot on the edge of town had expanded so that the platform stretched twice as long as he remembered. But underneath all that new paint and fresh timber, the bones of the town were the same, and the woman hanging sheets in the afternoon sun was most definitely the same as the one who had stood on this very street a decade ago and watched him ride away without a single word to stop him. He had thought about this moment. In the long, quiet years that followed, he had imagined it many times, the way she might look, the way she might react, whether she would turn her back on him or simply carry on as though he were no more significant than a passing stranger. What he had not anticipated was the way she stood there with a clothespin between her teeth and her dark hair pinned loosely at the back of her neck, and her work dress catching the breeze, completely absorbed in her task, and somehow more herself than any version of her he had managed to keep alive in his memory. He did not call out to her, not yet. He was not certain he had earned the right to call her name. Walter Wallace was 32 years old, broad-shouldered and trail-worn, with a jaw that had not seen a razor in several days, and a coat that had seen too many seasons of weather. He had left Caldwell at 22 with nothing to his name but a horse, a bedroll, a six-shooter, and a head full of pride that had convinced him the wide world was better suited to a man of his ambitions than a small cattle town on the Kansas prairie. He had spent those 10 years proving himself both right and wrong in equal and humbling measure. He had drifted south into Texas, worked cattle drives up the Kishom Trail 3 different seasons, done a stint as a deputy sheriff in a hard little Texas border town, lost most of what he saved in a bad winter, built it back up doing honest work for an honest rancher outside of Abilene, and then, somewhere in the deep quiet of the previous winter, had come to understand with perfect and undeniable clarity that the thing he had been searching for in all those miles and all those years was not something he was going to find by moving further away from where he had started. He had started here. She had been here. And here, apparently, she still was. He dismounted at the livery stable and handed his horse over to the young man who came out to meet him, paid for a stall and feed, and then stood in the afternoon heat for a long moment gathering something that he understood, with some embarrassment, was courage. He had faced down cattle stampedes and men with bad intentions and winters cold enough to freeze a man to his saddle, and none of it had required this particular brand of nerve. He walked to the boarding house, which was owned and operated by a woman named Mrs. Clara Tillman, who had run it since before Walter was born, and who was, by reputation, the kind of woman who knew every piece of business in a 20-mile radius before it had fully happened. The front door was open against the heat, a screen door keeping out the flies, and he knocked on the frame and waited. Mrs. Tillman appeared from the interior depths of the house with the expression of someone who had been interrupted in the middle of something important, which, given that it was 4 in the afternoon, probably meant supper preparations. She was a small woman in her late 60s, with sharp blue eyes and iron-gray hair, and the posture of a woman who had decided long ago that the world would simply have to accommodate itself to her rather than the other way around. She looked at Walter for a long, measuring moment, and then her expression shifted into something that was not quite a smile but was close to recognition. "Walter Wallace," she said. "Well, I suppose the prodigal has made his return." "Yes, ma'am," he said. I was hoping you might have a room available." "I have two," she said. "You'll take the one on the second floor, less noise from the street. 50 cents a night, $1.75 for the week if you mean to stay that long." "I mean to stay," he said, and heard the certainty in his own voice with something like surprise. She gave him a long look that communicated plainly that she had opinions about this, opinions that she was keeping behind her teeth for the time being, and then stepped aside to let him in. He paid her for a week and she gave him a key and pointed him toward the stairs. He was halfway up the staircase when her voice came from below, dry and even. "She's been running the laundry service out of the back of this house for 6 years now," Mrs. Tillman said. "And she has done very well with it, in case you were wondering, without any particular help from anyone who left town in a hurry in 1874. "I know," Walter said. "I wasn't going to presume otherwise." "Good," said Mrs. Tillman, and went back to her kitchen. His room was clean and modest, with a washstand and a narrow bed and a window that looked out over the backyard. From that window, he could see the clothesline, and he could see that Wilhelmina Hawkins had finished hanging the sheets and was now carrying the empty basket back toward the house with the efficient, unhurried stride of a woman who had a great deal to do and had long since made her peace with doing it. He stepped back from the window before she could look up and see him standing there watching her like some kind of haunting. He went down to the washroom, cleaned the road off his face and hands, changed into the best of the 2 shirts he had packed, and then went back downstairs and out into the early evening, because he needed to think and he needed space to do it in, and the small, clean room suddenly felt like it was closing in around him. Caldwell's Main Street was alive with the activity of the supper hour. Ranchers were coming in from the surrounding land. Cowboys were drifting toward the saloon at the north end, and the dry goods store was doing its last business of the day with a cluster of women who stood outside comparing the merits of the yard goods that had come in on the last train. Walter walked through all of it with his hat pulled down and his hands in his coat pockets, and he let the familiar sounds wash over him. The creak of wagon wheels, the occasional whinny from the hitching rail, the distant percussion of the piano in the saloon, the smell of horse and leather and coal smoke, and the particular dry sweetness of Kansas dust in the summer heat. He stopped at the small restaurant near the depot and ate a plate of beef stew and cornbread, and drank 2 cups of coffee that were strong enough to account for themselves, and he thought about what he was going to say to Wilhelmina Hawkins. He and Wilhelmina had grown up in Caldwell together, the children of 2 different families who had come west in the Great Migration of the 1860s and settled on neighboring pieces of ground. They had been friends since they were children, the kind of particular and absolute childhood friendship that forms between 2 people who understand each other without having to explain themselves. They had gone to the same one-room schoolhouse, ridden horses together across the same prairie, and somewhere in the years between 16 and 22, had quietly and without any great dramatic announcement fallen into something that both of them understood to be love. They had never formally declared it. They had never needed to. It had been as evident as the prairie sky, too large and too obvious to require comment. Everyone in Caldwell who was paying the slightest attention had assumed that Walter Wallace and Wilhelmina Hawkins would marry, and the 2 of them had assumed it too, in the comfortable, unspoken way of people who believe that the things they most want are simply waiting for them, patient and permanent, until they are ready. And then Walter had gotten restless. He had always been restless. It was the quality of him that Wilhelmina had found both magnetic and maddening. But at 22, the restlessness had become something he could no longer ignore or outrun with hard work and long days. He had wanted to see what was out there. He had convinced himself that he would go, make his fortune, come back in a year or 2, and the comfortable future would be waiting. He had left on a Tuesday morning in April of 1874 with the kind of breezy confidence that belongs exclusively to young men who do not yet understand how much a year costs, and how much 2 years cost, and how the cost compounds with interest the longer you let it run. He had written letters in the first year. She had written back. And then the letters had grown further apart, as the work of living swallowed up the time and the intention, and then there had been a gap, and then another gap, and then something that he had not recognized at the time as the slow, terrible silence of a correspondence dying. He did not know if she had married. He had not heard, in all his years away, that she had, but Caldwell was a long way from southern Texas and news traveled imperfectly. He had told himself, during the years when he was not thinking about her directly but she was there anyway at the back of everything, that if she had married well and was happy, and that was good. He had told himself this with the dedicated conviction of someone who does not entirely believe what he is saying. When he rode back into town and saw her at the clothesline, the relief that moved through him was something he was not proud of, relief that she was there, that she was real, that she was apparently singular and upright and operating her own laundry service out of the back of a boarding house. The relief of a selfish man, maybe, but real nonetheless. The next morning, he woke before the sun and lay in the narrow boarding house bed listening to Caldwell come awake around him, the roosters and the distant cattle and the creak of the building as the morning air moved through it. He dressed and went downstairs and found Mrs. Tillman already in the kitchen, and she gave him coffee without being asked and did not make conversation, which he appreciated. He was on his second cup when the back door opened and Wilhelmina Hawkins walked in with an armload of folded linens and nearly ran directly into him. She stopped. The linens did not fall, because she had the grip and composure of a woman who had been carrying things for a long time. She looked at him. The color that came into her face was not quite pink. It was the particular flush of someone whose body has reacted before their mind has caught up, and then the color steadied, and her expression settled into something that was carefully, deliberately composed. She was 29 years old, Wilhelmina Hawkins. She had the same dark eyes that he had memorized without meaning to, the same strong line of her jaw, the same way of holding herself very still when she was feeling something intensely. She was dressed for work in a practical dark skirt and white shirtwaist, with her hair already neatly pinned, because she had clearly been at her work for some time already. There was a smudge of soap on her left wrist that she had not noticed. "Walter Wallace," she said. Her voice was even and perfectly controlled and told him absolutely nothing except that she had also thought about this moment and had prepared for it. "Wilhelmina," he said. There was a silence that lasted perhaps 4 seconds and felt considerably longer. "You're staying here?" she asked. "I took a room yesterday afternoon," he said. "Mrs. Tillman didn't mention it," she said, which was a sentence aimed clearly over his head at the older woman, who was occupying herself with the stove in a manner that suggested she was hearing nothing. "I didn't ask her to," Walter said. "I was going to find you today and say hello properly." "Hello," said Wilhelmina, "properly." She moved past him to set the folded linens on the shelf near the door, and there was something in the precision of that movement that told him she was working very hard to keep herself on an even keel and that the work was costing her something. "You look well," he said, because he had to say something and it was true. "I am well," she said. "I have been well. It has been 10 years, Walter." "I know," he said. "I know it has." She turned and looked at him then, directly and fully, in a way that she had not done in those first suspended seconds. Her dark eyes were clear and serious and held something in their depths that he could not read, but that made his chest feel very full. "Why are you back?" she asked. It was the most direct possible question and deserved the most direct possible answer. "Because I understood," he said, "that there was no point in being anywhere else." She looked at him for another long moment, and then she picked up her empty basket and walked to the back door. Before she opened it, she stopped without turning around. "I close the laundry at 5 o'clock, she said. "If you want to say anything else, you can find me after that." She went out. The screen door closed behind her with a quiet, decisive click. Mrs. Tillman set a plate of biscuits on the table, sat down across from Walter with her own coffee cup, and regarded him with the air of a woman who has just watched a performance of some complexity. "Well," she said, You didn't do badly for a first exchange." "She's angry," Walter said. "She's not angry," said Mrs. Tillman. "If she were angry, she would have said considerably more and considerably louder. What she is, Walter, is careful. She learned to be careful. She had to." She took a sip of her coffee. "Now eat your breakfast and go do something useful with yourself until 5 o'clock." He spent the day doing what he had done on cattle drives when the work was slow. He made himself useful. He went to the livery stable and helped the owner, a weathered man named Gus Perkins, with some fence mending in the corral. Gus was a man who spoke in short sentences and appreciated practical help, and the two of them worked through the morning with the comfortable rhythm of men who understand physical labor and do not feel compelled to fill silence with noise. Around noon, the town began to make its midday movements, and Walter walked the length of the main street and reacquainted himself with what Caldwell had become. The cattle trade had changed since his time. The long drives up from Texas were becoming less frequent now that the railroads had pushed further south, and the character of the town had shifted somewhat from the wild, transient energy of a cattle shipping point to something approaching a settled community. There were more families visible, more women and children on the street, more permanence in the buildings, and less of the rough impermanence of a trail town. He stopped at the dry goods store and bought a new razor and a bar of shaving soap, because Mrs. Tillman had given him a look that morning that suggested his appearance could be improved, and because if he was going to talk to Wilhelmina at 5 o'clock, he did not want to do it looking like something that had washed in on a flood. He went back to his room and shaved with the careful attention of a man performing something that matters, and looked at himself in the small mirror above the washstand and tried to see what she would see. 10 years had put lines at the corners of his eyes and a certain weathered quality into his skin. He was not the easy, confident young man who had ridden out of town with such breezy certainty. He was something else. He hoped it was something better, but he was aware that hoping was not the same as knowing. At 4:30 he came downstairs and sat on the front porch in one of the rocking chairs and watched the late afternoon traffic on the main street and tried to make himself feel calm, which worked about as well as such efforts usually do. At 5 minutes past 5, Wilhelmina Hawkins came around the side of the boarding house from the backyard, wiping her hands on her apron, and found him on the porch. She stopped when she saw him, and then she came up the porch steps and sat in the other rocking chair and folded her hands in her lap and looked out at the street with an expression of deliberate neutrality. "The Whitmore family's laundry almost defeated me today," she said conversationally, as though they were continuing a conversation that had only paused briefly rather than one that had been suspended for a decade. "They have 6 children and a husband who works with livestock, and I do not think I will ever fully understand how a single family can generate so much laundry." Walter felt something loosen in his chest. He laughed, a genuine laugh, the kind that comes out of relief and recognition and affection all at once. "I did not know you had your own business," he said. 6 years, she said. "I started with 2 families in the hotel linens. Now I have 11 families in the hotel and the restaurant by the depot." A quiet note of pride in her voice, earned and honest. "I hired a woman named Ada Greer 2 years ago to help with the pressing. She is very good." "That's remarkable," he said. "Truly." She glanced at him sideways as though checking to see if he meant it, and he held her gaze steadily so she could see that he did. "Why did you stop writing?" she asked. The question came in the same conversational tone, and somehow that made it more serious, not less. "Because I was a fool," he said. "Because I kept telling myself I would write when I had something worthwhile to report, and the worthwhile kept not arriving, and by the time I understood that the problem was in what I was looking for rather than what I was finding, it felt too long, too much silence to break. I wrote to you for 2 years," she said, "after you stopped." The words landed in him like a stone dropping into still water. He had not known that. "I didn't know," he said. "Where did you send them?" "The last address you had given me, Fort Worth, care of the Drovers Association." Paused. "I suppose you had moved on by then." "I had," he said. I had moved south by then, Wharton County. He was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry, Wilhelmina. I am genuinely and deeply sorry. She was quiet for a longer moment, looking out at the street where the day was beginning to wind itself down, the long shadows of the false-fronted buildings reaching across the dust. I waited, she said. I don't say that to make you feel terrible. I say it because it is true and I have made my peace with it. For the first year I waited because I was certain you would come back. For the second year I waited because it had become a habit. By the third year I had stopped waiting and started living, which was considerably better for my general disposition. She said the last part with a dry humor that was entirely her own, and it made him want to smile and wince simultaneously. "Did you?" he began. "No," she said before he could finish the question. "I did not marry. There were two men who asked, both good men. I said no to both of them." She paused. "I told myself it was because I wasn't ready. But I think I knew, each time, that it wasn't right, that they weren't right." She finally turned and looked at him directly again, and her dark eyes were steady and honest. "I'm not telling you that to give you hope beyond what you've earned. I'm telling you because I've spent 10 years being honest with myself and I don't see any point in stopping now." "What have I earned?" he asked. "I don't know yet," she said. "I suppose that depends on what you intend to do while you're here." "I intend to stay," he said, "for good. I have money saved enough to buy land and start proper. I know cattle, I know horses. There's a piece of ground west of town that I heard is for sale, the old Meeker property. I've been thinking about it all the way from Abilene." He stopped himself, aware that he was talking fast, filling space with plans when she hadn't asked for plans. He made himself slow down. "But none of that is the point. The point is that I should never have left the way I left, and I should never have let the letters die. And I have known for a long time that there is no one else in the world that I want to talk to the way I want to talk to you, and I rode home because that finally became something I could not ignore anymore." The street was quieter now. A wagon rolled past in a cloud of dust, heading out of town. Somewhere down the block, someone was playing a fiddle, the notes floating thin and sweet in the cooling air. Wilhelmina was quiet for a very long time, long enough that he became genuinely uncertain what she was going to say. "I'm not the same person I was at 19, she said finally. "And you are not the same person you were at 22. Whatever we were to each other then, that is not a guarantee of anything now. You understand that?" "Yes," he said. "I am not going to fall back into step with you because it used to be comfortable," she said. "That is not something I am willing to do." "I am not asking you to," he said. "I am asking for the chance to find out what we are to each other now." She looked at him for a long time with those dark eyes that had always seen him rather too clearly for comfort. Then she stood up from the rocking chair and smoothed her apron with both hands. "I take supper at 6, she said. "Mrs. Tillman sets a table in the dining room. You are already a boarder, so you will be there too." A pause. "You may sit across from me." It was not a declaration. It was not a promise. It was an invitation to continue, and Walter Wallace accepted it with his whole heart. Supper at Mrs. Tillman's boarding house was a communal affair, served at a long table in the dining room, with 4 other boarders beside Walter, a traveling merchant named Hollies, a young schoolteacher from Ohio named Mr. Bright who was in his first year in Caldwell, a cattle buyer named Perkins who was in town for the week, and a quiet older man named Mr. Sauer who had lived at the boarding house for 3 years, and whose occupation no one seemed entirely certain of. Wilhelmina came in from the kitchen where she had been helping Mrs. Tillman, and she sat across from Walter as she had said she would, and they ate roast beef and potatoes and green beans from the kitchen garden, and the conversation around the table moved through the usual territory of boarding house dining: the weather, the state of the cattle market, the upcoming 4th of July celebration that the town was organizing. Walter watched Wilhelmina talk with Mr. Bright about the school, because she had apparently been involved with the school board since its founding, and he watched the animation come into her face when she talked about it, the quick intelligence in her eyes, the way she made an argument with precision and warmth simultaneously, and he felt the particular quality of admiration that comes from seeing a person you love be fully and completely themselves. After supper, the boarders dispersed to their various evenings. Walter helped Mrs. Tillman clear the table, which earned him a raised eyebrow and then a nod of approval, and then he stepped out onto the porch again into the warm Kansas evening. Wilhelmina came out a little while later with a shawl around her shoulders against the evening breeze, and she sat again in the rocking chair and they talked. They talked for 2 hours, easily and without strain, about the things that had happened in 10 years, his time on the trail, the border town deputyship, her building of the laundry business, the changes in Caldwell, the families they had known in childhood and what had become of them. Her father had died 4 years ago, she told him, quietly, of a chest illness that had come on fast in the winter. Her mother had gone to live with Wilhelmina's sister in Wichita 2 years after that. "I am sorry about your father," Walter said. "He was a good man." "He was," she agreed. "He asked about you once near the end. He wanted to know if I had heard from you." She said it without accusation, just as a fact. I told him I hadn't in some time. The guilt of that sat on Walter's chest like a stone, and he did not try to push it away or excuse it. He let it sit there and be what it was. They talked about his plans for the Meeker property, and she asked sharp, practical questions about the land and the water rights, and the market for beef cattle that told him clearly that 6 years of running her own business had given her a thorough education in practical economics. He answered her questions as honestly and thoroughly as he could, because she deserved honest and thorough answers, and because he was coming to understand, impressing her now would require substance rather than charm. When she finally said good night and went inside, and he sat alone on the porch in the warm dark with the stars very bright overhead and the sounds of Caldwell settling into its nighttime quiet, he felt something he had not felt in 10 years. He felt like he was in the right place. The following week was a slow unfolding. He and Wilhelmina fell into a rhythm, cautious at first and then more natural, of morning coffee conversation and evening porch sitting, and the occasional midday walk through town when her work allowed. She was busy, genuinely and substantively busy, and he respected that without making any attempt to alter it. He found his own busy. He went out to look at the Meeker property with its owner, a lean and sun-dried man named Old Pete Meeker, who was selling up to go live with his son in Missouri, and what he found there was encouraging. The land was good, the well was reliable, the existing structures were sound if somewhat weather-beaten, and the asking price was within reach of what Walter had managed to save. He made an offer. Old Pete Meeker countered. They shook hands on a figure that satisfied both of them, and Walter rode back into town with the particular satisfaction of a man who has put a stake in the ground after too many years of drifting. He told Wilhelmina at supper that evening. She looked up from her plate and studied him with an expression that he could not fully read. "You actually did it," she said. "I actually did it," he confirmed. "When do you take possession?" "End of the month." "Pete needs 3 weeks to move his things out." She was quiet for a moment, looking at her plate, and then she looked up at him with something in her eyes that was very close to the thing he had been hoping for, but that she was clearly not ready to name out loud yet. "It is a good piece of land," she said. "I used to ride out that way when I was young. The creek in the south pasture used to run very clear in the spring." "Still does," he said. I checked. A smile came to her face, small and genuine, the kind she did not seem to realize she was doing. He stored it away carefully. On the following Saturday, which was a bright and windy July day with the sky so blue it seemed almost theatrical, there was a difficulty. Walter had gone to the saloon at the north end of the main street, not to drink particularly, but because the saloon served as one of the informal news exchanges of the town, and he wanted to know more about the water rights situation in the county, which had been a subject of some local dispute. He was at the bar with a beer he was mostly ignoring when a man came in who he did not recognize. A big man with a red face, and the particular swagger of someone who has had several drinks already and intends to have more. This man's name turned out to be Garfield Cobb, and he was, according to the bartender's quiet murmur, a rancher from the south end of the county who had a reputation for believing that the world owed him more than it was currently delivering. Cobb had apparently had a dispute with Wilhelmina Hawkins that had been running for some weeks. He had refused to pay for 3 months of laundry service, claiming that some of his household linens had been returned damaged, which was disputed entirely by Wilhelmina and by Ada Greer, who had both thoroughly inspected every item. Walter learned all of this from the bartender in the space of about 90 seconds, and then Cobb sat down heavily on a bar stool 2 places away, and announced to no one in particular that the laundry woman on the edge of town had sent him a written demand for payment through the banker, Mr. Ellis, which he found insulting beyond his ability to properly express. "That woman has got no business sending lawyers after a man," Cobb said, to the room in general. "Some people in this town need reminding of their proper place." There was a silence in the saloon of the kind that falls when everyone in a room is looking somewhere else with great deliberate care. Walter set his beer glass down on the bar carefully, with great deliberateness. "That woman," he said, in a calm and conversational tone, "is Wilhelmina Hawkins. She runs a legitimate business, and she is owed legitimate payment for legitimate work. Sending payment demands through proper channels when a debt goes unpaid for 3 months is not a matter of anyone reminding anyone of their place. It's a matter of basic business practice." Cobb turned and looked at Walter with the expression of a man who has just been surprised and does not like surprises. "You a friend of hers?" Cobb asked. "I am," Walter said, "and I'd encourage you to think carefully about the next thing you say." What followed was not a fight, exactly. It was the frontier equivalent of a negotiation conducted at very close quarters with a great deal of tension, and not much actual physical violence. Cobb blustered, Walter remained steady and quiet, and the bartender made it clear that any actual trouble would result in Cobb's permanent removal from the establishment, which Cobb apparently valued. After several minutes of pointed and uncomfortable exchange, Cobb left with the stated intention of discussing the matter with his wife, which the bartender later told Walter generally meant that Cobb would calm down, talk to a sensible person, and do the right thing. 2 days later, Cobb paid Wilhelmina the full amount owed through Mr. Ellis at the bank, without further complaint. Wilhelmina heard about the saloon exchange from Mrs. Tillman, who had heard it from the bartender's wife. In the approximately 12 hours it took for any notable event in Caldwell to complete its circuit through the social network of the town. She found Walter in the backyard that evening, where he was fixing a fence post near the chicken coop that had been leaning at an angle that was probably concerning to the chickens, and she stood with her arms crossed and looked at him with an expression that contained several competing things. "You went to talk to Garfield Cobb," she said. "Not intentionally," he said. "He came to the saloon while I was there. The subject came up." "I did not ask for anyone to fight my battles," she said, and her voice had an edge to it. "I know that," he said, "and I didn't fight your battle. Your battle was already won. You engaged the bank and the law was on your side. What happened in the saloon was that a man said something disrespectful about you in a public place, and I objected to it. Those are different things." She was quiet for a moment, looking at him with those measuring eyes. "What did he say?" she asked. "That some people needed reminding of their proper place," Walter said. Her jaw tightened. "And what did you say?" "That your name was Wilhelmina Hawkins, that you ran a legitimate business, and that sending payment demands through proper channels when a debt goes 3 months unpaid is basic business practice, not impropriety." The edge in her expression softened slightly, not into approval exactly, but into something that acknowledged he had chosen the right ground. "He paid," she said. "I heard," Walter said. "I was going to win that regardless," she said. "I know you were," he said. "I never doubted it." She looked at him for another long moment. Then she uncrossed her arms and looked at the fence post. "That post has been leaning since March," she said. Mrs. Tillman kept saying she would get to it. "Almost done," he said. She nodded, turned, and went back into the house. But as she went, something in the set of her shoulders had changed. Something that had been held tightly was held a fraction less tightly, and he thought that perhaps he had not entirely misread the situation. In the weeks that followed, the barrier between them, not a wall exactly, but a careful distance, a deliberate maintenance of space, began to soften in the way that barriers soften when two people spend enough time in the same proximity being honest with each other. They walked out to the Meeker property together one evening, just as the sun was getting low, because she had said she wanted to see it, and he had said she was welcome to come whenever she liked. They walked the fence lines, and she asked about the south pasture, and they stood at the creek, which was clear and cool, and she took off her shoes and stockings, and waded in up to her ankles with a matter-of-fact practicality that he found completely charming. "The grass in the north field is going to need work before winter," she said, looking out over the land with those dark eyes that always seemed to be assessing things with complete accuracy. "It's been let go." "I know," he said. "I'm planning to get 2 men in to help with the fence work and then deal with the north field before the heat breaks." "What are you going to run?" she asked. Cattle and horses," he said. "There's a market for good horses. I spent 2 years working for a man who bred quarter horses, and I know what I'm doing." She was quiet for a moment, standing in the creek with the water moving around her ankles, her shoes dangling from one hand, looking at the land spread out around them in the long evening light. The Kansas sky was enormous above them, layered in gold and rose in the first pale blue of coming night, and the grassland stretched away in every direction in that way it had that made a person feel both very small and very free. "It's good land," she said. "You could make something real here." "That's what I intend," he said. He hesitated. "It would be better, everything would be better if I wasn't doing it alone." He said it quietly, without pressure, and she heard it the way it was meant, and she turned and looked at him standing on the bank in the evening light, and something moved across her face that was so unguarded and honest that it made his throat tighten. "You have been gone 10 years, Walter Wallace," she said, "and you have been back less than 1 month. Do not ask me for the whole thing at once." "I'm not," he said. "I'm asking for however much you're willing to give, at whatever pace you're willing to give it. I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him for a long, still moment with the water moving around her feet and the evening deepening around them both. "I know," she said. And in the way she said it, not as a challenge, not as a question, but as a plain statement of something she had concluded, he heard the first real movement toward him, the first crack in the careful wall. On a Saturday evening in late July, the town held its summer social in the open ground beside the church, which was an annual event involving a fiddle band and a caller and long tables of food brought by various families, and a general suspension of the usual weekday seriousness. The whole town came out, from the oldest established families to the newest arrivals, and the evening was noisy and warm and full of the particular good-natured energy of a community that has found a reason to gather. Walter asked Wilhelmina if she would attend with him. He asked it simply and directly, at breakfast, in front of Mrs. Tillman and the other boarders, which meant there was no possibility of the question being misunderstood in its intention. Wilhelmina looked at him steadily across the table for a moment that stretched while the other boarders examined their plates with concentrated interest. "I was planning to attend anyway," she said. "I will walk with you," which was, in the social language of Caldwell, Kansas, in 1884, a rather significant statement. They walked to the social together in the warm evening, Wilhelmina in a dark blue dress that he had not seen before and that had clearly been brought out for occasions of consequence, and Walter in his best shirt and coat with his hat cleaned and shaped back to a semblance of respectability. The town watched them arrive together with the barely concealed interest of a community that has been waiting for a development and is gratified to see it materializing. They ate supper at one of the long tables with Mrs. Tillman and several of Wilhelmina's acquaintances from the school board, and then the fiddle band started up and the dancing began. Walter was not a fine dancer, but he was willing and capable, and when he offered his hand and asked her, she took it without hesitation, and they moved out onto the cleared ground with the other couples. Dancing with her was nothing like he had expected and everything he had hoped. She was good at it, better than he was, with a natural ease of movement that made his lack of fine technique irrelevant, because she simply moved with him and made it work. And after the first two songs, the self-consciousness left him entirely, and there was only the music and the warm evening and her hand in his, and the way she smiled when the caller called something complicated and they both stumbled on the same step and then recovered it. They danced 4 dances and then stepped to the edge of the gathering to breathe, and she was flushed and bright-eyed in the lantern light, and he thought that she was the most beautiful person he had ever seen in his life, and that he had always known that, and that knowing it and doing nothing about it for a decade was the greatest and most expensive mistake he had ever made. "I have missed this," she said, looking out at the dancers. "I don't say that about you specifically. I mean evenings like this, being easy." She paused. "I have been very careful for a very long time." "I know," he said. "You have had reason to be." "I am tired of being only careful," she said. It was said to the air in front of her rather than to him directly, but it was meant for him, and he heard it. He reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically, not with any great announcement, just reached out and took her hand in his gently and left the decision about what happened next entirely with her. She looked down at their joined hands for a moment, and then she looked up at him, and what was in her face was something he had last seen 10 years ago and had thought, in his darker moments, that he would never see again. She did not pull her hand away. They walked home from the social together in the warm dark, hand in hand, saying very little because very little needed to be said. The night was full of cricket song and the distant sound of the fiddle fading behind them and the smell of the prairie in the summer dark, dry and sweet and enormous. At the gate of the boarding house she stopped, and she turned to face him, and in the light that came from the window she looked at him with those honest dark eyes and said, "I have not forgotten a single day, Walter." "Not one. Do you understand what I am telling you?" "Yes," he said, "I understand." "Then make sure," she said quietly, "that you do not give me reason to regret letting you back in." "I will spend the rest of my life making sure of it," he said, "if you'll allow me to." She looked at him for one more long moment, and then she raised herself up and pressed her lips to his cheek, briefly and warmly, and then she went inside and left him standing at the gate in the summer night with his hat in his hands, and his heart so full it was almost inconvenient. August arrived and brought with it the particular punishing heat of the Kansas summer, the kind that shimmers off the road and makes the distant prairie look like water. Walter moved out to the Meeker property, his property now, though it felt strange and wonderful to think of it that way, and began the work of making it a working ranch. He hired 2 men he found through Gus at the livery stable, a compact and competent cowhand named Reuben, who was in his mid-30s and quiet-natured, and knew cattle as well as any man Walter had ever worked with, and a younger man named Tomas, barely 20, the son of a Mexican family who had settled near Caldwell some years back, who turned out to have an extraordinary gift with horses. The 3 of them worked through the August heat on the fences and the north field and the outbuildings, and Walter came into town most evenings for supper, partly because Mrs. Tillman's cooking was better than anything he could manage in the field, and partly because Wilhelmina was there. Their evenings together became something he lived for with an intensity that he tried not to make too obvious, because he understood that she was moving at her own pace and that pace was the right one. They walked. They talked. They sat on the porch in the cooling evenings and she read aloud to him, sometimes from the newspaper or from the books she borrowed from the school library, and he told her stories from the trail, and she laughed at the ones that were meant to be funny and was appropriately appalled by the ones that were meant to be cautionary. And gradually, Week by week, the careful distance continued to close. In early September, he showed her the house on the property, the original structure that old Pete Meeker had built, a solid four-room affair that needed work but had good bones. He had spent several weeks cleaning and repairing it, replacing rotted boards and rechinking the walls and putting a new coat of whitewash on the exterior, and he walked her through it with a mixture of pride and nervousness that he was aware made him look somewhat transparent. She walked through every room with her particular evaluating attention, looking at the ceilings and the floors and the windows and the fireplace, and he watched her and waited. "The kitchen needs a proper stove," she said. "I know," he said. "It's on the list. The bedroom in the back corner has the best light," she said. "Yes," he said. "That's why I thought it would be the main one." She stood in the kitchen, looking out the window at the south pasture and the creek beyond, and the morning light fell across her face and shoulders, and the whole scene had a quality that made him feel as though he was seeing something he had always been meant to see and was only now arriving at. "It needs a great deal of work," she said. "It does," he agreed. "But it could be very fine," she said, "with the right attention." "That's what I thought too," he said. "That's exactly what I thought." She turned from the window and looked at him, and in her eyes was something warm and decided and finally unguarded. "Walter," she said. "Yes," he said. "I have been thinking," she said, "that 10 years is a very long time to have waited for something without quite admitting to yourself that you were waiting. And I have been thinking that I am 29 years old and that careful has served me well, but that there is such a thing as too careful." She paused. "And I have been thinking that when you look at me the way you are looking at me right now, I feel exactly the way I felt when I was 19 and you were the most important person in my world, and I have not felt that in 10 years, not once, not with anyone." His heart was doing something so loud he was mildly surprised she could not hear it. "What does that tell you?" he asked. "It tells me," she said, "that I would very much like for you to ask me something." He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and took both her hands in his and looked at her with everything he had, everything he was, every mile of those 10 years and every day of the month since his return and every year of knowing her before that. "Wilhelmina Hawkins," he said, "I have loved you since I was young enough not to know what love was, and I have loved you through 10 years of being too foolish and too far away to do anything about it. And I love you now with everything I understand myself to be. I have a house that needs a proper stove and a ranch that needs building and a life that needs building too, and I would like to build it with you. I would like to spend every morning of the rest of my life knowing that you are the person I am waking up next to. Will you marry me?" She looked at him for one breath and then another. Her eyes were very bright. "Yes," she said. "Walter Wallace, yes, yes, I will marry you." He pulled her close and she came willingly, and when he kissed her, it was the kind of kiss that contains all the weight of a very long absence and all the warmth of a very long history and all the hope of what is coming, and it tasted like the end of one long, wrong thing and the beginning of everything right. They went back to town holding hands in the September morning, and when they told Mrs. Tillman, the old woman sat down in her kitchen chair and pressed her lips together very firmly and said, "Well, it is about time," and then got up and went to the pantry and came back with a bottle of wine she apparently kept for significant occasions, which Walter thought was about the finest thing he had ever seen. The wedding was planned for October, which Wilhelmina said was sensible because the heat would have broken by then, and she could wear her good wool dress, which was more practical than anything cotton. The town seemed to regard the whole affair as a matter of collective satisfaction, as though Caldwell itself had been waiting for this resolution, along with everyone else. They were married on the 14th of October, 1884, in the small church on the east side of the main street, on a cool and brilliantly clear day with the sky so vast and blue it seemed to go all the way to the edge of everything. Mrs. Tillman stood with Wilhelmina. Reuben, who had become a steady and trusted presence on the ranch, stood with Walter. Tomas sat in the 3rd row and took his hat off with great ceremony. The schoolteacher Mr. Bright read a passage he had chosen carefully. The minister performed the ceremony with genuine warmth and a minimum of preamble, which Walter appreciated. When Wilhelmina walked down the aisle in her good dark wool dress with her hair pinned up and a small cluster of late-blooming wild flowers from the creek bank at the Meeker property, his property, their property tucked into the arrangement, Walter stood at the altar and felt something settle inside him with the permanence of a foundation being laid. Not relief, exactly. Not triumph. Something quieter and more absolute than either of those. The feeling of being exactly where he was supposed to be, standing in front of the person he was supposed to be standing in front of, on the day he was supposed to have arrived at, even if it had taken him 10 years longer than it should have. She looked at him as she walked toward him with the particular directness that was entirely and specifically her, and when she reached him and took his hands, her hands were steady and warm, and she was smiling, and it was the realest smile he had ever seen in his life. The vows they spoke were the traditional ones, repeated after the minister, but the way they said them to each other, quietly and with weight, gave each word more than its usual meaning. When Walter said, "I will," his voice did not waver, and when Wilhelmina said, "I will," she looked at him as she said it with eyes that were bright and full and absolutely certain. The reception afterward was held in the social ground beside the church, with most of Caldwell present, and there was food and the fiddle band again and more dancing, and Walter danced better this time because he had been practicing in the evenings out at the ranch, a fact that he had told no one, and that she apparently discovered mid-first dance because she pulled back slightly and looked at him with a raised eyebrow. "You have been practicing," she said. "I have no idea what you're talking about," he said. She laughed, and it was the laugh he had been carrying in his memory for 10 years, warm and full and lit from within, and it was even better in the original than it had been in the keeping. They moved to the ranch at the end of October. The new stove had been installed, a proper iron cookstove that Walter had ordered from the catalog through Mr. Ellis at the hardware, a source of considerable satisfaction to Wilhelmina, who approached cooking on a good stove with the same practical competence she brought to everything. She passed the laundry business to Ada Greer, who was more than capable of running it, keeping a small ownership share that brought in a steady, modest income, and maintaining a quiet pride in what she had built. The ranch came alive under 2 sets of hands. Reuben managed the cattle with the quiet efficiency that was his nature, and Tomas worked with the horses and proved, season by season, to be as gifted as Walter had suspected. Wilhelmina threw herself into the life of the place, with a thoroughness that told Walter she had been waiting for something to build for a long time, and that she intended to build it properly. She established a kitchen garden that by the following summer was the finest in that part of the county. She reorganized the household accounts with the precision of a woman who had run her own business for 6 years and knew exactly where money went and how to make it go further. They talked every evening, the two of them, the way they had always talked, the way that felt as natural and necessary as breathing. About the ranch, about the town, about what they were reading and thinking and wondering, about the small perfect details of ordinary days that become, in the accumulation, the whole substance of a life. The winters on the Kansas prairie were not mild, and the winter of 1884 into 1885 was a hard one, with weeks of bitter cold and snow that locked the ranch down and required constant vigilant work to keep the animals safe and the structures sound. But there was something in the closed-in quality of those winter weeks that Walter would remember later as among the best of his life. The two of them by the fireplace in the evenings, the ranch quiet and white outside, the warmth of the house against the cold, her voice reading aloud, the way she looked in the firelight with her hair down and her feet tucked under her on the chair. One evening in February, with the snow deep outside and the fire very warm and a pot of beef soup keeping itself hot on the stove, she looked up from her book and looked at him across the fire and said, "I am happy. I want you to know that. I am genuinely and thoroughly happy." He looked at her, this woman who had waited for him for years and then built herself a life without waiting and then been waiting still in some deep and private way without even fully acknowledging it to herself, and who was now here, in the house they were building together, with her feet tucked under her and her face warm from the fire. "So am I," he said. "So am I, Wilhelmina." In the spring of 1885, she told him she was with child. She told him quietly, one morning over breakfast, with the same directness she brought to everything significant, and watched his face as she said it. He set down his coffee cup and looked at her and felt something so large move through him that he temporarily lost the ability to produce words, which was a condition he could not recall being in before. "Well," she said, because the silence had gone on long enough that she apparently needed to know what it meant. "I am," he said, and then had to stop and start again. "I am the happiest man in the state of Kansas. I am possibly the happiest man alive. I am." He stopped himself before he became incoherent and got up from the table and went to her and knelt down next to her chair and took her hands in both of his. "Are you well? Are you feeling well?" She was smiling, the warm, full smile. "I am feeling perfectly well," she said. "Somewhat tired in the mornings, but otherwise entirely myself." He pressed his lips to her hands and looked up at her. "A baby," he said, with the simplicity of someone who has just encountered a fact too large for elaboration. "Yes," she said. "In October, I think. October. The same month they had married 1 year before." He did not say this aloud because he did not want to be sentimental in a way that made her laugh at him, but he felt it. He helped her more carefully through the spring and summer months, not in a way that treated her as fragile. She would not have tolerated that, and she was demonstrably not fragile, but in the way of a man who is attending closely to the well-being of someone precious. He took on more of the heavier outdoor work so that she could manage the household tasks without overextending herself, and she accepted this without comment, which told him she appreciated it, and he understood her well enough by now to know that no comment was a form of acknowledgement. The ranch had its first full productive season in the summer of 1885. They sold 20 head of cattle in July, well priced, because Reuben knew the market and Walter had spent enough time on drives to know how to present animals to advantage. Tomas had trained 3 horses to a standard that brought buyers from as far as Wichita, and the income from those sales exceeded Walter's initial projections by enough that he came home that evening and told Wilhelmina about it with the barely suppressed excitement of someone who has just received a favorable verdict. She looked at the figures he had written down and then at him and said, "Good. We should put half of it against the land and put the rest toward an additional structure. You're going to need proper facilities for the horses if you mean to continue that line." He looked at her and said, "Marry me again." She looked up from the paper, startled, and then laughed. "I'm already married to you," she said. "Fortunately," he said, and kissed her on the top of her head. Their son was born in the 3rd week of October, 1885, exactly 1 year and 1 week after their wedding. He arrived on a clear, cold night, with the help of the doctor from town and Mrs. Tillman, who had insisted on coming out to the ranch for the occasion, and who presided over the whole affair with the authority of someone who has attended a great many births and has strong opinions about how they should be conducted. Walter spent the hours of Wilhelmina's labor in a state of barely contained anxiety, doing useful things to keep himself occupied, keeping the fire, keeping the water hot, keeping himself out of the way of Mrs. Tillman, who had made clear that his primary function at this point was to be available and unobtrusive. When the doctor came out of the bedroom and told him he had a son, Walter sat down on the kitchen chair and put his face in his hands for approximately 30 seconds, which was the amount of time it took him to collect himself to a state of functionality. His son was strong and healthy and loud, making his opinions about the world known with vigorous clarity from the first moments of his existence. He had Wilhelmina's dark eyes, and what the doctor said was a very good set of lungs. Wilhelmina lay back against the pillows looking exhausted and triumphant and completely herself. And when Walter came in and she put the baby in his arms for the first time, he held his son with the enormous careful attention of a man who has never held anything so important in his life. "He looks like you," Wilhelmina said. "Around the jaw." "He has your eyes," Walter said. "Thank God for that." She laughed, tired and warm, and then winced and then laughed again. "What shall we call him?" They had discussed names. They had several in consideration. But looking down at the baby in his arms and then up at Wilhelmina, Walter felt the name settle into place with the certainty of something that was always going to be true. "Thomas," he said, "for your father," her father who had asked after Walter near the end, who had deserved to see this and had not lived to. Wilhelmina's face did something very still and very full, and her eyes went bright. "Thomas," she said. "Yes, Thomas Wallace, Mrs. Tillman from the doorway cleared her throat and said that Thomas Wallace was an entirely acceptable name, and that everyone should now get some sleep, and then departed for the kitchen to make tea, because she found emotion most manageable at a slight distance. Thomas Wallace grew through his first year with the same determined thoroughness that characterized both his parents, pulling himself upright against the furniture by 8 months, and taking his first wobbly steps at 11, and saying his first word, which was cow, a fact that delighted Reuben unreasonably, at 10 months. He had Wilhelmina's directness and Walter's stubbornness in exactly the wrong combination, which meant that by the time he was 2, he was already the most opinionated small person on the ranch, and possibly in the county. The ranch expanded. Walter bought the additional parcel to the north that came available in 1887, which gave them access to better summer grazing and a second water source that had been one of the limiting factors in their operations. He hired a third hand, a steady man from Missouri named Clement, and between Reuben and Tomas and Clement and his own labor, the operation was producing at a scale that made it genuinely viable rather than merely survivable. Wilhelmina did not retreat into the house and leave the ranch to Walter. That was not her nature. She managed the household accounts with the same precision she had always brought to her finances, was deeply involved in decisions about the cattle and the horse breeding operation, and maintained her connection with the school board in town, which she had come to care about with real conviction. She believed that the school was the thing that would determine what kind of place Caldwell became in the next generation, and she brought to the school board meetings the same combination of sharp intelligence and practical determination that she brought to everything. She also wrote letters, good ones, long ones, to her mother in Wichita and her sister, describing the ranch and the progress and Thomas, and the particulars of their life with the kind of vivid, specific detail that made her mother weep happy tears, according to her mother's responding letters. Wilhelmina shared these letters with Walter over supper sometimes, reading the good parts aloud, and it became a reliable part of their evenings that he cherished without ever saying so directly, because some things were better held quietly than announced. In the spring of 1888, Wilhelmina told him she was with child again. She told him the same way she had told him the first time at breakfast, watching his face, but this time there was something easier in the telling because she already knew what his face would do. He did not disappoint her. "A baby," he said, with the same simple large surprise, as though babies were still a concept requiring repeated acquaintance. "Your capacity for astonishment remains remarkable," she said fondly. "Is it wrong that I feel exactly the same as the first time?" he asked. "No," she said. "It is not wrong at all." Their daughter was born in November of 1888, healthy and clear-eyed, with a full head of dark hair and the immediate serious attention to her surroundings of someone with a great deal of assessing to do. They named her Clara, for Mrs. Tillman, who had been a fixture in their lives for long enough that leaving her out of the naming felt like an oversight they were not prepared to make. Mrs. Tillman, when informed of this, sat very still for a moment and then said, in a voice that was careful and controlled and not quite even, that she was gratified and that Clara was a sensible name, and that the child had better live up to it. Then she had gone into the kitchen at the boarding house and been very busy in there for some time. Thomas, who was 3 years old when Clara arrived, received his sister with the combination of fascination and proprietary concern that eldest children bring to the arrival of a sibling. He was convinced for several weeks that Clara was a gift of some kind that had arrived specifically for his benefit, and gradually revised this position as Clara made clear that she had her own views on the matter. The life they built was not without difficulty. Ranching in Kansas in the late 1880s had its hard seasons. There were years of drought that stressed the grazing and years of severe winter that took livestock, and the economic pressures on cattle ranchers generally were a constant background concern as the markets shifted, and the railroads continued to reshape the geography of the trade. There were seasons when Walter came in from the work worried and came to bed late, and Wilhelmina would be awake, because she always knew when something was weighing on him, and they would talk through it in the dark, her voice quiet and steady, her thinking always clear. There were also injustices they could not ignore in the world around them. Tomas, who had become one of the most valued people on the ranch, and whom Walter and Wilhelmina both considered a friend, faced a quality of treatment in town that was often unfair and sometimes openly contemptuous, simply because of his heritage. Walter had witnessed this firsthand on several occasions and had made his position clear each time, which did not change the broader situation, but at least made clear what standards applied on his property and among his associates. Wilhelmina took a more systemic approach, raising the matter at the school board and advocating for the equal education of all children in the district, which was a position that not everyone on the board shared, but that she held with the tenacity of someone who does not intend to lose an argument she has already decided is right. The world was imperfect, and they lived in it fully aware of its imperfections, and they did what they could within the range of what two ordinary people could do. But the life was good. The life was genuinely and substantially good. Reuben found a wife in 1887, a quiet and capable woman named May, and Walter and Wilhelmina attended their wedding with the warm recognition of people who understand what it means to finally find the right thing. Tomas's mother came to live nearby and became a quiet and permanent presence at the edges of their world, someone Wilhelmina called on when she needed a second pair of hands and whose tamales at Christmas became a tradition that Thomas and Clara would later regard as one of the fixed and essential facts of the holiday. Mrs. Tillman came to the ranch for Sunday dinners frequently enough that it became a standing arrangement, and she sat at the head of the table. She always sat at the head of any table she was at, because that was simply the correct location for Mrs. Tillman, and presided over the meals with her particular dry approval, occasionally offering observations about Thomas and Clara that were offered as neutral comment and received as the deep pride they clearly were. Walter Wallace was 40 years old in 1892, and he stood at the fence of the north pasture one evening in late summer watching the sun go down over the Kansas grassland, with the long perspective of a man who has been a great many places and done a great many things and has arrived at last at the place where all of it makes sense. The grass was golden in the evening light, and his cattle were dark shapes moving slowly across it, and the horses were in the near pasture, and the house behind him had lamplight in its windows, and from somewhere inside he could hear Wilhelmina's voice and Thomas's voice in what sounded like a lively disagreement about something, with Clara's higher voice occasionally interjecting with some observation that he could not quite make out. He listened to those three voices, his wife's and his children's, in the warm evening air, and felt something so complete and so still in himself that it seemed to fill him from the soles of his boots to the crown of his hat. He went inside. The kitchen was warm and smelled of supper, and the argument, which turned out to be about whether Thomas had completed his schoolwork before going out to help Reuben with the cattle. An argument that Wilhelmina was winning comprehensively, and with cheerful certainty, because she always won arguments about schoolwork, it being her firmest conviction that education was not a negotiable item. Thomas, who was 7, looked to Walter with the expression of someone hoping for an ally, and was met instead with a look that communicated clearly that he was on his own. "Your mother is right," Walter said, setting his hat on the hook by the door. "You did not even hear what it was about," Thomas protested. "About your schoolwork," Walter said, "and your mother is right." Thomas subsided with the dramatic resignation of a 7-year-old who understands he has lost and is not yet sophisticated enough to lose gracefully. Clara, who was 3, looked between her brother and her parents with the bright, evaluating attention that was already entirely her own, and apparently concluded that the right was on her mother's side, because she went and stood next to Wilhelmina in a show of solidarity. Wilhelmina caught Walter's eye over the children's heads, and the look they shared was the kind that only happens between two people who have been paying close attention to each other for a long time, full of humor and warmth, and the specific, irreplaceable intimacy of shared knowledge. After supper, after the children were abed and the house was quiet, they sat together by the fire in the comfortable habit of many evenings, and Wilhelmina had her book and he had the week's newspaper from Wichita, and they read in the warm quiet, and the fire snapped and the night was very still outside. After a while she said, "Mrs. Tillman asked me today if we were planning any more children." He looked up from the newspaper. "What did you tell her?" "I told her it was none of her business," Wilhelmina said, which is true but also possibly not what she wanted to hear. "Is it something you're thinking about?" he asked. She looked up at him with her dark eyes that still saw him so precisely, and she was quiet for a moment. "I think I might like one more," she said, "if the world has any more to offer." He set the newspaper down. He was looking at her with the look that had not changed in all the years, the look that said she was and had always been the fixed point of everything he cared about. "Then I think we should find out," he said. Their second son was born in the summer of 1893. They named him James. He arrived in July with a great deal of enthusiasm for the world and an immediate affinity for the horses, which Thomas discovered when James, at 8 months, managed to get himself to the fence of the near pasture and sat down in the dust and looked at the horses with an expression of absolute contentment. 3 children, a working ranch. A house that had become, over the years, not just sound but beautiful in the particular way that homes become beautiful when they are loved and lived in, and added to and tended carefully. The kitchen garden in full summer production. The additional rooms Walter had built on the east side when Thomas and Clara needed their own spaces. The long porch with the 2 rocking chairs that were always set at the angle they had found most comfortable. The window boxes with the flowers that Wilhelmina planted every spring. In the fall of 1893, Walter was in town at the feed store when he ran into a man he had not seen since his early trail driving days, a drifter named Calhoun, who had the look of someone who had spent the intervening years in the same purposeless motion that Walter had finally escaped. They talked for a few minutes in the sidewalk outside the feed store, and Walter told him briefly about the ranch and the family, and Calhoun listened with an expression that Walter recognized from the inside, the expression of a man who understands he has missed a turning somewhere and is not entirely sure how to find his way back to it. Walter gave him the name of a rancher south of town who was known to be looking for reliable help, and Calhoun took the information with a gratitude that said he understood what was being offered was more than just employment intelligence. They shook hands and parted, and Walter loaded his feed supplies into the wagon and drove home through the afternoon, and thought about the long, strange road of a life and the mercy of endings that close cleanly. He arrived home as the late afternoon light was making gold of everything, the house and the pastures and the grass and the distant line of the creek willows, and Wilhelmina was on the porch with James on her hip and Clara beside her, and she shaded her eyes with her free hand and watched him come up the lane, and when he pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down she said, Supper is almost ready." And he kissed her, and she kissed him back with the warmth of many years and one simple, irreplaceable choice made and remade every day. Thomas was in the barn helping Reuben, because Thomas at 8 had discovered that cattle were his passion and his natural territory, a fact that Walter regarded with enormous private pride. James was trying to wriggle out of Wilhelmina's hold with the determined purpose of getting to the horses, and Clara was telling her mother something very long and very detailed about what had happened at school that day, because Clara had her mother's mind for detail and her father's thoroughness, and expressed both these qualities primarily through narration of very significant length. Walter stood in the yard of his ranch in the fall of 1893, with the Kansas sky enormous overhead, and the grass gold and the air carrying the first cool edge of the coming season, and his wife on the porch and his children around her, and the work of the day behind him and the work of tomorrow waiting, and all of it, every bit of it, real and solid and exactly right. He had ridden into Caldwell a stranger to himself in the June of 1884, come back to the place he had left and the woman he had left there, and she had been waiting not in the passive way of someone with nothing better to do, but in the way of someone who had built herself a full and capable life, and yet kept, in some private and honest room of herself, the space that he had vacated. She had not forgotten one day of those 10 years. She had told him so. And she had not forgiven him easily or quickly or without requiring him to earn it, because she was Wilhelmina Hawkins, Wilhelmina Wallace now, though she kept Hawkins for her business dealings, because she had built that name and it meant something and she was right to keep it, and she did not do anything lightly or without full consideration. But she had let him back in. She had put her hand in his at the summer social, and she had said yes in the kitchen of the house that needed a proper stove, and she had stood beside him in the church on the clear October day, and said "I will" with her eyes steady and certain, and she had built everything that followed with him with the same absolute competence and wholehearted engagement that she brought to every good thing she committed herself to. He walked up onto the porch and James immediately reached for him, and he took his youngest son and settled him against his shoulder, and Clara kept talking because interruption was not a concept she recognized, and Wilhelmina looked at him with her dark eyes in the late afternoon light, and in those eyes was everything he had ever wanted to find: warmth, certainty, humor, the absolute knowledge of who he was, and the complete willingness to be there anyway. "Penny for your thoughts," she said. "Not worth a penny," he said, "just counting what I have." She raised an eyebrow in that way she had, part humor and part challenge and part something that would never stop being the most compelling thing he had ever seen. "And," she said, "and I am the richest man in Kansas," he said, "possibly in the nation." "Possibly" is doing a good deal of work in that sentence, she said, but she was smiling, and James was patting him on the face with a small, enthusiastic hand, and the supper smells were coming through the door, and the evening star had appeared in the deep blue of the early dusk, and Clara had arrived at what sounded like the most important part of her school story. They went inside. The fire was laid. The table was set. The house was warm. Outside, the prairie went on forever in every direction, vast and quiet and dark, the same land it had always been, indifferent and magnificent, under the great bowl of the Kansas sky with its uncountable stars. And inside, a man who had once ridden away from everything worth having and had had the extraordinary grace to find his way back, sat down to supper with the woman who had been the fixed truth of his entire life, and their children around them, and felt, with perfect and unqualified completeness, that the long journey had finally, really at last, arrived.